Hi, I'm Lenina Rassool, your host on Mental Health Matters on Cape Town TV, where we speak about all things mental health and more. And today we are speaking about the mental health and mental issues of frontline workers, who are those in helping professions, often working in communities, providing help and services to people there. Now, the reason we are speaking about the mental health of frontline workers is for many of us, we are frontline workers or helpers within our homes and in our communities. After the break, we are going to be speaking to Tracey-Lee Kotzen, who is the CEO of the Mental Wellness Initiative, also known as MWI. During the COVID pandemic and lockdown, MWI provided psychosocial services to frontline workers, and we want to discuss some of their findings in terms of how does mental trauma and vicarious trauma manifest in people who help others, and what kinds of psychosocial tools can they give us to help us manage this trauma better. But before that, we are going to look at a short video about resilience in communities and what types of protective factors are needed to help us manage traumatic events and situations. Let's have a look.
Let's imagine a South Africa where everyone can live, play, and walk safely in their neighborhoods. A place where all people are and feel safe, and where communities can thrive. This is the vision of the Inclusive Violence and Crime Prevention Program, a joint South African-German development cooperation initiative. But this vision does not have to be just a dream. Making South Africa safe is possible. But where does violent behavior come from? Often it is a result of the environment people live in. Extreme inequality, overcrowded living conditions, inadequate access to good education, personal experiences of violence, and social attitudes that accept violence as a way of dealing with conflict are all examples of risk factors that can trigger violent or criminal behavior. The more risk factors someone is exposed to, the more likely he or she will become violent or become a victim of violence. Understanding these risk factors is the first step in preventing violence and crime. But just as there are risk factors that can trigger violence, there are also protective factors that help prevent violence from occurring in the first place. Such protective factors would be, for example, to provide a nurturing home environment with positive role models, to ensure young people have access to high-quality education and support for their personal development, to promote gender equality, and to create safe public spaces and provide recreational activities. The more protective factors that guard people throughout their lives, especially from a young age, the more resilient they become and less likely to be a victim of violence or to engage in violent behavior. To reduce risk factors and strengthen protective factors requires an integrated approach to violence and crime prevention that looks at the challenge holistically. Preventing violence and crime cannot be achieved by any single actor alone. The VCP program promotes such an integrated approach. It focuses on collaboration across different sectors and enhancing the skills of key role players to contribute to community safety. The South African government has adopted several integrated policies that promote violence prevention and help realize the goals of the National Development Plan and the International Agenda 2030. To support the effective implementation of these policies, the VCP program assists national, provincial, and local government to better understand and carry out their roles in preventing violence and crime. This helps to ensure, for example, that municipalities receive the information, training, and resources they need to make communities safer. Community safety is a collective responsibility. The VCP program supports various exchange platforms and networks to promote collaboration and knowledge exchange between all spheres of government and civil society. For example, the online knowledge portal Safer Spaces or the Urban Safety Reference Group, a peer learning forum that links South African cities. Citizens understand their communities best. Therefore, the VCP program explores innovative ways for them to be involved in making their communities safer. Many young people in South Africa have the strong desire to play a part in making a positive contribution to safety. The VCP program promotes interventions that empower the youth to become active citizens, training them to reach out to their communities, winning people over as change makers for safety, and becoming more resilient to risk factors in the process. Violence is preventable if we join in the efforts to address its root causes. Let's all play our part to make South Africa a safer place for everyone.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and today we are speaking about the mental health of frontline workers who are often on the front line of trauma. And joining us in studio today is Tracey-Lee Kotzen, who is the director of the Mental Wellness Initiative. Tracey, welcome, and thank you for joining us. So Tracey, you're here today because Mental Wellness Initiative did a sort of a study or a program with frontline workers during the pandemic, and it was really just to measure and look at some of the experiences that they were feeling around their own mental health while they were helping other people cope, right, with the pandemic. Right. And so tell us a little bit about Mental Wellness Initiative and also about the program that you did.
Sure. Mental Wellness Initiative was actually started when the pandemic started, so those two things hit us at the same time. And our focus at that stage was bringing emergency mental wellness services to frontline workers who still had to deal with what was at that stage escalating community distress that was being caused by the pandemic.
Yeah.
We've evolved since then, the pandemic being, having subsided. I don't know if I can say it's over, but having subsided. So we've evolved since then, and we do a lot of development work within the social justice sector, focusing on mental wellness. We work with frontline workers, as you've said. We work with leaders in that space. And the main deliverable for us, well, there are a couple. One is we really want to tackle the stigma of mental health and to be able to open up those conversations. We want to further empower the social justice sector with tools for healing and trauma recovery. And we do a lot of that as a sector with communities. But are we doing that for ourselves as humans? And I'm not sure the answer can be yes every time. And so those are sort of the two main focus areas for us.
So I thank you for that. And I want to, bring in the analogy because you're speaking about, we're helping other people, but are we doing the same thing for ourselves? And there's the analogy of the empty cup. You cannot, you cannot give from an empty cup. So if you are depleted, it's really difficult to help someone else. And so as we go into sort of what this program was about, I think you mentioned emergency mental wellness, which is great. Frontline workers are people at the front line. What types of frontline workers were you guys working with?
Right. So in the social justice sector, we would be dealing with people who are social workers, who are emergency responders to community needs. So it could be, and it's quite broad. So I would regard police people as frontline workers.
Paramedics, I was thinking about.
Nursing and doctor staff, social workers, as I've said, psychologists. Anyone who is there at really the grassroots level of addressing a community's need. Even people who are taking food parcels into community. And those people experience a lot of vicarious trauma because of what they see.
And can I ask you to just explain vicarious trauma? Because I hear it, but what does it mean?
Absolutely. So vicarious trauma means I'm experiencing trauma because I'm seeing your trauma. So it's not happening to me, but I witness it, and therefore I onboard a lot of that traumatization. So that's a simple way of understanding it. And often the vicarious trauma hits people and they don't necessarily have the skills to manage it. So they're out there doing good work for the community, but without the ability to actually come home and create safety, psychological safety, emotional safety, and containment for themselves. So those are the frontline workers that we would have dealt with.
You know, I want to say another conversation I had once with somebody from the South African Faith and Family Institute who were working with churches. They were speaking a lot about even ministers and pastors coming through, especially males who I mean, and you don't think about it that way, but vicarious trauma, they are dealing with people's problems, with death in families, etc. And so when you speak about it's not happening to me, but I am affected by the trauma that's happening to someone else as I'm helping them. How does that manifest? I think as helpers, we don't think about how we are affected by somebody else. We're just focused on like sort of helping this other person.
Right.
What are ways that vicarious trauma can affect people and the body?
Well, in the body, mind, spirit, it's a full person impact, I would say, not just body. One of the perpetual challenges for the sector is that people are sitting on the brink of burnout almost all the time. And there's this notion in the social justice / social development sectors that as my exhaustion becomes a status symbol. Becomes something that I wear on my sleeve, becomes something that is my mark of being a good servant to my community. And if I'm not exhausted and on the brink of burnout, am I doing a good job? You know, and so there's a boundary issue there. How it affects people, well, the symptoms of, and burnout and then burn in. So I use the term burn in inverted commas because it's an emerging condition that is sort of a mix of burnout and cabin fever, because we were in lockdown conditions. So people couldn't access the normal support systems that they would go to. You could not even go to church if your pastor was your person. You couldn't go to your best friend's house. We were limited to what we could do on media and our phones and laptops and such. And so being in lockdown, being holed up in the house, being unable to access your normal support systems, but also working no longer an 8-hour day. Because if you're in this civil society sector and you're servicing a community, if someone's in crisis at whatever time of the day, 24 hours, and you are a responder, you must respond. And a lot of things escalated during lockdown, and so emergencies were happening more frequently. And so people were stuck in their homes, couldn't access help, were working much more than 8 hours a day. And then this idea of I'm working from home, so I have to prove that I'm being productive, which is where a whole lot of those extra working hours came from. And people feeling like they needed to overperform in case somebody thought they weren't performing. And in the background of all of that was that people were losing jobs during COVID. So I'm going to overperform because I'm working at home and I want to make sure I can also keep my job. And then they've got families at home with them in this container. Sleep deprivation was a big thing. Overexposure to media was a big thing because you're just in front of the computer. And even during your escapism time, you're escaping into social media or escaping into Netflix. So it was really a lot of computer stuff. People were getting sick physically, emotionally. And then there was an interesting thing we discovered where people were feeling quite guilty about the fact that COVID didn't hit them as hard as it may have been hitting others in their spaces. So that was some of the emerging findings for us. And those findings were taken from 33 people who are in leadership positions within the social justice sector.
So I'm finding all of the stuff that you're saying really interesting. I also, you know, what's coming to me also is that we know that COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown really exacerbated things that were already problems, right? So when we're talking about vicarious trauma and we're speaking about sort of exhaustion, those things were already present in the social justice sector.
Correct.
And so now it was much worse.
Right.
I want to ask you, so just because the vicarious trauma is also fascinating in the way that when you're speaking about it's not happening to me, but I'm exposed to it, did you find maybe within narratives that people also don't feel entitled to be traumatized by this thing? So you're dealing with people who have lost their jobs, who are devastated, who can't eat, and you are almost, it's almost when you think about the way we're affected sometimes when there's a war in another country or, things are happening to people outside, but we don't feel entitled because it's not happening to us. There's a bit of confusion about how we have to deal with that.
Right.
Did that come through?
So I think as human beings, we tend to compare ourselves to each other in a number of different ways. Someone is skinnier than me, richer than me, lives in a nicer neighborhood than me, and it's not surprising then that we would apply the same comparisons to our degrees of trauma. And so it's quite prominent that if I'm exposed to really high degrees of trauma in my work and something traumatic happens. So for example, if you lose your child, but I lose my dog, how do I talk about losing my dog?
That's a good analogy.
When I'm sitting in the presence of someone who's lost a child. And it's come up in me because I actually saw a bit of a Facebook spat about that sort of thing. Someone had said, oh, I understand how you feel because I lost my dog. But they were talking to someone who'd lost a child.
Oh, wow.
And it erupted. And so not to take away from the fact that your experience of pain and my experience of pain feels equally significant to the two of us, even though the causes of that might be quite different. But we do tend to compare that our trauma it's not as bad as what so-and-so is going through. So I'm not even going to talk about it or acknowledge it because I'm trying to acknowledge what I think is a bigger trauma with someone else.
That is a really good analogy. That's a really good way to frame that. And I think, comparison is a big problem sort of across the board. You were also talking about people's sort of uncertainty. Some of the results, you said people were getting sick and so forth, and they were feeling guilt also, sort of a survivor's privilege, because when we're thinking about pandemic, I was watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and so this was filmed during the pandemic, and what came through there was what they depicted was some really deep emotions about why me and not them. How did sort of that guilt or that privilege guilt manifest for some people?
So it was a surprising finding for us. We know about survivor's guilt as a sort of more general function of trauma, but we didn't expect to find it in the pandemic conditions. And so a little bit related to the notion of this comparison between my trauma is not as bad as your trauma or vice versa, people were feeling that their privilege, because COVID was really non-discriminant, right? It kind of randomly affected different families. So for people who didn't have as bad of an effect on their family, so they maybe didn't lose someone, they maybe didn't lose a job, they actually felt guilty over the fact that their families had survived. They felt guilty over the fact that, particularly also related to their relationships with their beneficiaries, that beneficiaries were losing jobs, there was poverty, there was hunger, there was loss of life, but they felt like their families had been spared, and there was a lot of guilt in that space. So like you said, COVID, there were cracks before, but COVID kind of really opened them up quite a bit.
And what did Mental Wellness Initiative come in sort of to do?
Right, so we ran a program with frontline workers in the social justice sector, also leaders in those, and by social justice sector, I mean organizations that deliver services directly to communities. So it could be counseling services. Largely, these were organizations that work in the gender-based violence response sector, but also assorted organizations. And so with the leaders of those organizations and frontline workers who go into the communities, those were our two pools of people. The program it covered resilience, and resilience being the idea of, because there was nothing that could be done about the onslaught of what was happening. People couldn't get away from COVID, so you couldn't detach yourself from the situation. But how do you continue being self-aware, care for yourself, care for those around you, and sort of just absorb the blows that were coming from COVID, but remain functional, because they were inescapable at that time.
Yeah.
So the normal support things were totally inaccessible. And it was definitely an emergency intervention, all online. And so people would get together online and we'd workshop different aspects of resilience healing, leadership challenges that people were facing because of the effect COVID was having on their organizations. Their teams were burning out, their teams were losing family members. So it was really a lot of containment.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm thinking about when you're saying absorb the blows but remain functional, sometimes I like to think about it also, you know, when I think a lot about mental health, it's like we can't stop these things from happening, regardless of what it is. You know, death is going to come, everybody's going to experience death, but it's sort of trying to manage, having some tools to manage yourself through this. You and I were on the phone earlier this week, and you said something really interesting about resilience. And I wanted to bring it here because you were talking about, you know, you actually said, you know, one part of resilience is how do we absorb the blows, or we're talking about managing it. Resilience is often framed as the ability to bounce back from something. What you had said to me is someone told you, we can think of ourselves as resilient, or we think of South Africa as resilient because we've absorbed all these blows. But resilience is not the same as endurance. It's not just taking the blow, taking the blow, taking the blow, taking the blow. That is going to build on each other. And so what does this look, what is resilience? What do we need to think about in terms of resilience? It's not, you know, it's not just enduring everything that's put onto you. Are there steps that help us be resilient in a healthy way?
So let me give credit where credit is due. That conversation was with Liz Dartnell of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative.
Yes.
And we were interviewing her. And it was her, and I'd been thinking about this for a while, this idea of, is resilience actually a healthy concept? Or are we just saying, keep absorbing the blows? You know, what is this healthy notion of resilience? And so for us, I don't know if I have a simple answer for that, because I think it's an emerging question. At the moment, resilience for us is framed as, and not bouncing back, but growing from.
Okay.
So the other terminology that is used is post-trauma growth. And the idea of that is that you're going through this trauma, you're learning something from it, you're growing as a person, and at the other end of this trauma, you can incorporate those learnings into the way you show up in the world. The idea of bouncing back is potentially a fallacy, because once you've experienced trauma, you can't ever go back to the way it was before the trauma. You're fundamentally changed by it. And so resilience is the idea of understanding that even these challenges have useful components, you can learn from them. And absorbing the blows is I mean, for me personally, when I experience a challenge, I tend to lean into it, because oddly enough, I look forward to the lesson and the deepening of strength and the deepening of courage that comes from these challenges. I've personally found that when I pull away from a challenge, it actually makes it harder, because I'm resisting something that's happening anyway. And so I think resilience is a lot to do with the mindset of recognizing that there is opportunity in adversity, and finding ways to navigate the adversity, but sort of knowing there's a gift in it for you at some point.
Yes, and so when you're talking about changing the mindset, and I think someone else had said in one of the previous shows, there is an other side.
There is an other side.
This is not sort of, because people can get overwhelmed, and this is the, you know, this really big thing has happened, and it's the end of the world as I know it. And I guess probably the danger is to just fall into a victim complex and detract and not, you know, and let go of agency, or feel like there's no control. But knowing that, and I was specifically asking, okay, so there's another side. There's something that you know, you can feel better.
Right. I mean, let's start with there's definitely another side. But also when you're in it, it can feel like a black hole that is just sucking you in. Or you feel like you're at the edge of a cliff, and if you're going to fall, you're going to keep falling forever, and there'll be no end to it. And so it can swallow you whole, and you can feel like you're being swallowed by it. So you can say theoretically, hey, hang in there, there's another side to this, but when you're in it, it doesn't always feel like there's an other side.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have support when you are going through a challenge, because you may not actually have the tools in the moment to see the potential learning opportunities or strengthening or deepening of courage opportunities, to even see that there is an other side, because you feel like you're being swallowed in this moment.
You know, I often say it's such a funny thing, like, especially if you think about depression, it's like when you're on a low, you can't quite remember what a high feels like. And when you're on a high, you can't remember feeling that low. But I'm glad you brought in support networks, because I just want to come back to what you said earlier, which was during lockdown, we didn't have access to our support networks, but you framed it as church could be a support network.
Could be.
A session with my best friend. And what I'm hearing now is that even though we don't think of that as support networks, those are the spaces and places that remind us about the other side, the narrative that emerges probably when you're speaking to your friend and your friend says, don't worry, you know, maybe not don't worry, but like you can get through this, or whatever sort of comforting and motivating factors can remind us that there is another side. Right. We need to take a short break, but we will be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and today we are speaking to Tracey-Lee Kotzen, who is the director of the Mental Wellness Initiative, and we are speaking about the mental health of frontline workers. And we've got Tracey-Lee Kotzen here because the Mental Wellness Initiative did a study or did a program with frontline workers during the pandemic. But Tracey, you know, before the break, we were speaking about some of the mental health issues that frontline workers were experiencing. During the second segment, I wanted to broaden the terminology of frontline workers. You and I are both mothers, right? So we had to do a lot of the things in the household. We were often frontline workers in the house, right? I remember I was the one who went out to do the shopping, right? So you're worried about exposure. Oh my goodness, I'll never forget wiping down all of the groceries once you get back, you know, walking in the door, taking off all of my clothes, jumping straight into a shower, you know, and not seeing anyone for like a few minutes after that. And then also wiping down the house and just having the bulk of the worry about everyone else. You know, it was often parents, and I'm not going to say mothers specifically, I'm just using us as an example, but parents that had to worry about the kids and their exposure, just like everything. So would you say, and you work within civil society spaces, so you also know that there are frontline workers in communities, community-based organizations. Would you say we could also call that sort of frontline workers when we think about the type of things that we're worried about, the type of ways that we were helping other people?
So absolutely. And I want to agree with you and expand it beyond COVID. Okay. Because COVID popped in, and please God, it is now popping out. But even before COVID, people were domestically frontline workers at community level. And you don't need to have the title and the job description to have the burden of delivering that to your community and to your household. And so it's a sad fact that we don't acknowledge those people on a daily basis, what people are doing at their communities, in their own homes, just to keep things going, to keep people healthy and fed and educated and, you know, alive, because there's so much home care that happens. And you're right, Nina, not just women, but men as well, having held that role.
And then, Tracey, also breadwinners, right? The ones who are holding down the jobs, who have possibly lost their jobs, and all of a sudden, you know, they're at the front line of not being able to go out and buy groceries or buy food. Those are also, you know, you could also consider that frontline work.
You can. You can, because of the exposure. Firstly, if we come back to the pandemic, the exposure, the worry about bringing that home, that created a lot of anxiety for people. But I'm going to go out there, get the groceries, which was a normal everyday occurrence until the pandemic hit. And then what I bring home could potentially be deadly. So there was a lot of anxiety for people around that. And as you were saying, and there were, I mean, debates all over social media about degrees of paranoia with sanitizing everything afterwards. But it was a real concern for people, and a valid one, because there was so much we didn't know about how the virus was moving around. And people had huge anxiety about that. just leaving home.
So let's look at how that sort of frontline work in terms of families and communities could also result in sort of vicarious trauma. It wasn't just that we were having people sort of dying in our household. Not that we were just losing people in our house. Neighbors were dying.
Right.
Extended family members were dying. And so there is this onslaught within our communities also of this happening all the time. And so that's also vicarious trauma, right? That is also, I am affected by this amount of deaths in my community.
Right. And for some people, there were really a lot of deaths. I know of a family that recorded 13 deaths in their family and extended family. And so you get to a point where you're just so overwhelmed and grief-stricken. It's way past anyone's ability to cope with that much. And again, not being able to access the normal support system. So we're moving away from frontline workers, but I want to point out that there was such a loss of our traditional ways of mourning, traditional ways of burying people. Funerals couldn't be had at some point. And so we lost, and that's such an important part of the grief processing that we need to do. And so not only were deaths, happening frequently, you didn't have time to recover from one to the next, and then you still had to show up, work your what used to be 8 hours are now 12 hours a day because you work from home, look after your family, and there was just very little access to any kind of support.
I want to come back to this notion of support and in the spirit of mental wellness, right? How important is, what you're speaking about is interacting with other people, social interaction, being around people. You spoke about burn-in. We have read, we know that during the pandemic there was, a loneliness, obviously, because we weren't seeing other people, but also loneliness is a huge loneliness and isolation is a huge feature of depression in general. How important is social interaction for mental wellness, not just like in the context of the pandemic, but generally?
Generally, the more socially connected you are, the better the predictor of you recovering from something traumatic. So to say that inversely, people who are not socially connected have a much harder time recovering from something adverse. And that is also very true for children. I heard somewhere the other day, anecdotally, that you need 8 hugs a day to thrive as a human being. Physical contact, physical touch is actually really important for mental health. So not just conversing, but touching, holding, hugging, all of that is really important for your body, for your sense of well-being. And generally, it's crucial. In the pandemic, it robbed us of hug. We couldn't even hug each other. You couldn't hug someone without them flinching, or reach over to touch them without them flinching. And it's been a while now that we've been maskless and people are shaking hands again, but there are still those who are like, I'm not touching, I'm not hugging. So we're not completely over that sort of loss of physical contact. But now the bombardment of these multiple traumas that were hitting us as a society all at the same time, and then we lose the ability to hug and touch and comfort each other in physical ways. And so that just added to the trauma because we need social connection to heal. People without social connection really struggle. Healing is a community activity. It is supposed to happen in the presence of others. Others to hold your space, others to, simple things. You can just take someone a cup of tea and sit with them. You don't have to say anything. Be present to what they are going through and just hold their space so they can feel what they feel in a safe container. And you can create that safe container, and you can be anyone to create a safe container, right? You don't have to have a title. You just have to be a present, compassionate human. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but healing is a community activity.
It totally does, and I love the context within which you said that. I also wanted to speak about, when you speak about recovery. Okay, before we do recovery, so we are and let's say helpers. We speak in the context of frontline workers. I wanted to look at within families and within communities. There are certain people who are always helping. They are people that whose door you're going to go knock on if you need something, or there's no food, or you need to go. I know within the GBV space, we have some women in communities or some people in communities that will go to the police station to go and report something. There's always, you could be sort of that person. And then if you're always helping, again, to come back to the empty cup, it's important to help yourself. Yes. Now, we know this. What was interesting for me that came out of your program, and I've got some of the significant findings here, was some of the physical ways the lack of self-care manifested. Right. And I'm going to read here, they do not use, some of the frontline workers were not using their medications as prescribed. So even though they might have been helping other people take their medications, if we're thinking in terms of, let's say nurses, and they're laying out like all of these things that other people need to do to take care of themselves, they are not, taking their own medications as prescribed. They are not sleeping enough. Physical self-care is in distress. So so I wanted to ask you about that. There are physical ways that this stress manifests on people.
Right.
And so, were there any sort of, what does this look like? So, because I'm trying to think of someone at home, they're overwhelmed. What are indicators for them that they are possibly suffering from burnout, that they're possibly not taking care of themselves?
Right. And so this is why this burn-in idea is such an interesting one, because it's not immediately recognizable, because you actually look very functional. You're putting in your 12 hours a day of work, but you are literally zoomed out. You are non-functional in an interactive kind of way. There's some withdrawal because the things that would normally fuel you are not there. People's sleeping patterns were insane. Eating patterns were insane because we were not eating and sleeping. It's as if the thing that regulates time disappeared. So you could spend 36 hours in your pajamas and not realize it because you didn't have to get dressed and leave your house. And there was quite a lot of that where people had said that I hadn't showered in 2 days and I didn't notice.
I was going to ask about showering,
And I didn't notice because I didn't have to go anywhere. So I got up, I got my laptop, I eat constantly because there's no regulation of time for meals. And so it's not that these people were necessarily exhibiting ill mental health symptoms, but I mean, there was just no template for how to deal with a pandemic. It was the first global pandemic in our lifetimes. And the global pandemics before that were terrifying. They wiped out massive chunks of population. And so we had that history to go on. And so the fear was very real. And so it's the anxiety, it's the losing people. And then on a physical level, everything that regulates your normal behavioral clock was just gone. You were eating at weird times, people sleeping at weird times, not showering, and not showering because they're depressed, but not showering because they just didn't have a cause to get up, and that behavior regulation was gone. And I think a big factor of it was that people struggled with the people who are needing exercise, the exercise junkies amongst us. I'm not one of them, but I envy their commitment. That was difficult because people couldn't leave the house, go to the gym, walk around the block even. And so there's this antsiness of I want to do something, but I'm so stuck and limited in the house. And so we're still trying to figure out, long term. There are a couple of studies underway to try and actually name some of these specifically COVID conditions, the combination of being locked up in your house, but working or rather overperforming work-wise on a computer. And that combination, because we've not seen that before. There's new things emerging.
So you guys, Mental Wellness Initiative came in, right? You're helping frontline workers who are essentially helpers, right? And we know with a helping personality, it is very difficult to ask for help. And so, you did these multiple sessions online. There was a lot of talking, obviously, social interaction. Did it come through that it was difficult for them to, you said earlier, difficult to see it when you're in it, but was it difficult for them to accept that they were struggling? Was it difficult for them to reach out for help?
So you can see it in the stats on that program that we offered two components to it. The one was group programs online, and then the other one was individual counseling. The uptake on the individual counseling was surprisingly low. So when you are asking people who are on the brink of burnout to attend another thing, it sounds and feels like another task. So the plate is overflowing, and now you're piling another thing on top. And they just didn't have the capacity to do another thing. It just felt like another job. It was difficult for them to perceive it as, I need to do this as an act of self-care for me, because they did not have any more time, energy, attention to give to another task.
I love that you brought up self-care. You know, this is a show about mental health. We know that within the mental health space, especially sort of in the media space, magazines and everywhere, self-care is a huge word, is a huge, I would venture to say, buzzword. There are narratives emerging now where a lot of it says self-care is not just bubble baths and stuff, because our perception, it has been marketed and sold as it should be a holiday away, or it should be a bubble bath, or it should be, you know. But what was interesting about your study was that when you guys were talking about self-care, you were really just talking about like looking after yourself. What are healthy ways of self-care and looking after ourselves?
So
I mean, what does self-care really mean is essentially what I'm asking.
Right. So can I just say that we are socialized, and I aim this particularly at the nurturers amongst us, which would be predominantly women, but we are socialized to sacrifice ourselves so that others can be taken care of. Children, spouses, parents, and we are consistently at the very bottom of the list. You know, and then work, and for me, work is, I have a job and I have so many staff to look after, but if you're on the front line, your work is the hundreds of beneficiaries that depend on you. It's not one job, it's hundreds of people through your job as the channel. And so you are number 500 on your list of 500 priorities. And you never get past the top 200 things because your capacity as a human being is so limited. So can we just, as a blanket statement, say, we should no longer be socializing people in general to just completely sacrifice themselves? In fact, I would like to say that a priority number one in any person's life should be themselves. I cannot mother if I have not eaten, slept. If I don't sleep, I become a crazy person in the worst way. Eaten, slept, had a walk, spoken to a friend, poured out my soul about whatever's sitting in it.
I'm gonna say though, because if we're looking at patterns, part of the problem is that we can mother, we cannot mother in the best way that we can, or in healthy ways. I mean, I think about this often. I saw like a short TED talk the other day, which was interestingly looking at incivility or rudeness, right? And the number in the workplace they were talking about, they were saying the number one cause of incivility or rudeness in the workplace. I'm talking about, you know, when they were talking about workplace, they were talking about employees being shouted at, a boss, you know, instead of saying this work isn't good, like tearing up this stuff, you know, just like really traumatic sort of rude incidences, was stress. So for me, I've been noticing that if I am really stressed and I have too much on my plate and I'm not getting through it, I'm more prone to snap at my family.
Exactly.
Actually, I won't actually snap at my colleagues, but you know, your home is your safe space, so you're more prone to snap at people. I'm more prone to snap at my 8-year-old daughter and have sort of less patience when I have to ask her 3 times to go and brush her teeth.
Right.
And so that becomes really interesting. And I wanted to give sort of a physical aspect of what that looks like, right? So less self-care, there's a reason why we need to prioritize itself. It makes us do the things that we want to do better.
It does. Firstly, you then thrive in your various roles. You will thrive in your role as a whatever, employer, sister, brother, daughter, mother. You will thrive more because you used the analogy early on, the cup is full. I cannot, address your thirst if my own cup is empty. And I think that we've just not socialized people to prioritize themselves. In fact, we call it selfishness when they do. Yeah. And I'm going to say, I am all for selfishness if it means that I look after me so that I can look after you. I can't do it on an empty tank. So that's really important. Healthy self-care means asking for what you, firstly, recognize. So it's the practice of recognizing what you need.
Yeah.
Sometimes we run on autopilot.
Yeah.
In fact, I was saying to your team here that I've now missed 3 meals. So I have to take myself into an autopilot. So I flew in late last night, missed supper.
Yes.
Didn't have breakfast this morning, and it's now lunchtime. I'm pretty sure I didn't have lunch yesterday either. So I'm now coming up to the 4th meal that I've missed, and I'm being fueled by caffeine and sugar.
But you've recognized it.
But,
It's not a perfect system, but it starts with recognizing it. Tracy, I'm so sorry. We need to take a short break, but we're going to continue the conversation after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and we have been speaking to Tracey-Lee Kotzen from the Mental Wellness Initiative about the trauma and vicarious trauma and mental health issues experienced by frontline workers, and then, frontline workers being those people at the front of sort of other people's trauma, but also recontextualizing frontline worker as you could be the frontline person in your household for other people's trauma and problems. You could be the frontline person in your community, so the person that everyone comes to when they need help. And we were talking about, Tracy, we left off where we were talking about self-care. We were talking about how this vicarious trauma, the way that we are affected by helping other people, manifests in us maybe not sleeping enough hours. We are so worried about everyone that our appetite is affected. We can get physically ill from it, and also a lack of self-care. And so just to come in and say also we are debunking sort of the commercialized version of self-care, which is go take a bubble bath. And I have to say, like, my worst thing is, I know exercise is important. We've spoken about how important exercise is, but like, I hate it when it's sort of the commercialized version of this exercise or classes or really smart looking things. Whereas my GP told me, gave me a prescription to take a slow walk around the park with 0 earphones and just be with myself and just walk in nature. There was no like go pay for, a really expensive class to try and put myself into a pretzel and feel bad. So I wanted to expand on what does self-care look like. And if I may, because it's our last few minutes, Tracy did mention that one of the things that we are afraid of is that people, if we take time for ourselves, people will call us selfish, right? We want to acknowledge upfront that probably for the majority of us, we're afraid of taking time for ourselves. We're afraid of lessening the load, lest we be judged. But Tracy, just take us through, what does proper self-care look like?
I want to take a step back on something that you just said and say that the struggle for self-care could itself be a product of trauma. So if you had a traumatic experience earlier in your life, which created disconnect between your mind and your body, it's actually very difficult. And you and I have had this conversation before, maybe even a year ago now, where sometimes you can't even tell that you need to go to the bathroom because you can't even feel what's happening in your body. You can't feel that you're tired or hungry or thirsty until you're falling over because there's such a disconnect, and that disconnect itself could be a product of trauma. So people may have every intention to practice really good self-care. Your example, exercise. Me too, I suck with exercise. I walk into the kitchen to fetch water, but I leave with coffee, and I have no memory of how that happens because it's this autopiloted thing.
Also, and I want to say, like, it's also a feature with me, I find it really easy to ignore my body's signals to go. So I'll be aware I need to go to the toilet. I'll know I'm hungry, but you know, I'm in pain somewhere, but I find it really easy to sort of push through those things for myself.
And I think that's not uncommon. So even when we have these really good intentions for self-care, what we sometimes don't have is the ability to follow through on that. And then we judge ourselves harshly, causing all sorts of shame storms inside ourselves because, you know, I'm not even able to go to the gym for 20 minutes and now I'm just going to berate myself. And so sometimes self-care is getting someone else to say, how am I doing? So I could call a friend who knows me well and say, how am I doing at the moment with looking after me? What do you think? You're my very good friend. What do you think you would recommend that I do? And then try and do it together with someone. So a gym buddy is easier than going to the gym on your own. But again, when you are on the brink of burnout, it can be really hard to have any kind of capacity for that because you actually don't have the battery span inside yourself to add another task. Going to the gym can just feel like another job. Going to the veggie shop to buy your healthy fruits and vegetables can just feel like yet another task that I have to manage. And so going to get junk food out the kitchen is just simpler. Not going to the gym and laying in front of the TV just feels easier.
So could we sort of say, sorry to break your word, but could we sort of say, I mean, somewhere where I got to was like, sometimes self-care is just accepting the limitations. So for me, it's like, I'm not going to think about what I'm eating, but I am going to make sure that I eat. So I'm going to eat 3 times a day. I'm not going to think about trying to, you know, go to the kickboxing class, but I'm going to walk around. Actually, I was telling myself this morning, I'm just going to commit to 2 laps around our very small park every single day. And I'm not going to put in, it's not for exercise or anything, no pressure. Just as long as I get to the park and I walk around it, even if I hate it, because I know that it's going to make me feel better. And so, and showering, really. I'm just going to get myself clean. It doesn't have to be long with like special things. And I don't even have to wash my hair. But I'm just going to clean myself. Even if it's like 3 minutes. And so self-care sometimes is just literally taking care of your basic needs. It could be, right? Taking your medication.
Exactly. And we know what those basic needs are. You've got to eat, sleep, medicate, get some exercise. We know that these are the basic survival things. But self-care is about more than making sure you're still alive the next day. Right? It goes into your spirituality. Do you feel connected to something that is meaningful to you, another human being, preferably? Do you feel appreciated, valued, loved? And so much of when we disconnect from self-care is because we feel disconnected from others and from community. And so we know what the list of self-care practices are. But when you're struggling to achieve that, and this is why that social support is so important, get someone to say, hey, and have the guts to ask people, how am I doing on my self-care right now? And someone who's honestly going to say, you know, you look like you've not slept enough. Can we talk about what's going on? And just open up that conversation. You know,
and
if you have
I'm thinking intentional about the person that you approach.
You should be intentional. Not everyone should have the right to be in that sacred space. You should be very intentional about who it is.
Okay, and I think that we are out of time, Tracy. Thank you for a wonderful conversation and some of the insights that you're sharing. I think I've learned something. I'm sure the viewers have learned something. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on Mental Health Matters. That's all we have for today. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye.